Hello, it's Wednesday, the 6th of September, 2017 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators in higher education. I'm your host, Heather Shea, broadcasting live from Michigan State University. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the four people joining me today to talk about confronting the reality of white supremacy in higher education. But before I do that, I need to give thanks to those who make these free webcasts possible. Today's episode is made possible by our sponsor, ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. You can visit myacpa.org to discover other personal and professional development opportunities. And if you have not yet registered for the 2018 convention in Houston, Texas, you can learn more by visiting the link we're tweeting now. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge, and thanks again to my friend and colleague Alex Sylvester for monitoring today's back channel. Please tweet us at Higher Ed Live and we'll do our best to incorporate your comments and questions into today's discussion. You can join me and Tony Duty, my brilliant co-host, live on Wednesdays at 1 Eastern Time. And all of our past episodes are free and easy to access in the online video archives. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. We want Higher Ed Live to become your go-to professional development resource. So to improve the quality and delivery of our content, we're sending out a link to an audience survey with a link. So we were sending out a link to an audience survey. Thank you, Alex, for tweeting that for me. All right, so now on with the episode. As the fall term is commencing on many college and university campuses across the US, we have heard from many practitioners and scholars, given the recent tragic events that unfolded in Charlottesville and yesterday's repeal of DACA, among many other things, of an urgent need to continue the conversation begun on previous episodes, where we've explored topics related to race, racism, social justice, student activism, and mistakes white people make. So today's panel is going to speak specifically about confronting the continuing realities of white supremacy and how those issues are facing institutions of higher education. We're going to discuss how this requires an approach to our work that acknowledges our own complicity, as well as attends with care and concern for our students, our colleagues, and ourselves. So 2 acknowledgments. First, I identify as a white cis woman. I recognize the privilege I have as such in this conversation and how the lens affects my perception. And while I and other members of our panel hold intersecting identities, I acknowledge the voices and perspectives who may be missing from the panel today. In fact, I am sad to share that Mamta Akapati, who was scheduled to participate today, is attending to campus emergency planning in light of Hurricane Irma bearing down on the coast of Florida, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and other Caribbean nations. We miss you, Mamta, and we wish you and your campus safety. Second, I want to acknowledge and give credit to Alex Lang, one of our panelists on today's episode, for their help in preparation, as well as to ACPA President Stephen John Quay and the association, who tweeted with the hashtag #ThisIsExactlyUs, which inspired the hashtag for today's episode title. So again, I am thrilled about the folks who have joined us on the panel today, and I'm grateful for you all who are watching. Welcome to the conversation. As each of you introduce yourselves, I'd like you to share just a few bits about your role on your campus, and then why you said yes when I invited you to participate in today's conversation. Alex, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Lang. My pronouns are they, them, and their. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Iowa, and I serve as a graduate research assistant in the Higher Education Student Affairs department. My motivation for joining today, one is the persistent violence of white supremacy must be met with a persistent resistance and good discussion about it. So by no means today are we in a 45 minutes of 1 hour conversation going to solve white supremacy, but this is an inspiration to continue these conversations moving forward. 2, I think what is also important for me in this conversation is that I have connection, like white supremacy very much affects right down to my core, to my family members, to kin of mine, and thus I have as we all should, have a stake in eradicating white supremacy on our college campuses and in our lives as well.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome. Claire, welcome.
Hi, Heather. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Robbins. I use she, her, and her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at Virginia Tech, which is close to Charlottesville. I have lived in the South for most of my life with all of my intersecting identities. And while this is home, I'm also aware of the parts of me and the parts of most people I know who are not welcome here. And at the same time, I know that it wouldn't be different in any other region of the country, including places where I've lived. For me, uprooting white supremacy is about uprooting all of the intersecting systems that keep one another in place and that are reinforced every day by the work of higher education. And I also believe we need each other in this work. And so the chance to connect with each of you today was a motivating factor for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. DL, welcome back. Oh.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, still for me, out here in Mountain Daylight Time. My name is DL Stewart. I use the gender pronouns ze, them, and zir as my proper referential pronouns. Now at just beginning my 17th year as a full-time faculty member at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And for me, part of this conversation, I think, is twofold. One of the reasons I am in this work and began down this path over 20 years ago, actually now, for the last 16 rather, that I have been a faculty member, is seeking the critical transformation of institutions of higher education in U.S. society and globally as well, to be more expansive for radical democracy. You know, the thing about Cornel West's use of the language of radical democracy, and that's not happening right now. And so for me, this is a part of doing that work. It happens in the classroom, it happens in the scholarship, and it happens in being part of conversations like this. I also think that it's important as an African American, as a and to connect and sort of Pan-Africanly, for me as a Black person, as a queer person, as a trans person who is impacted by white supremacy across all of those identities and everywhere I live. So Claire spoke to the realities of the South. I was born and raised in Harlem and New York City. I did my undergraduate and graduate work in Michigan and Ohio and began my career in Ohio. I'm now in Colorado. And I can tell you that across all three of those parts of the country and regions of the country, my family is from the South. Both parents are from the South and have relatives that still live between North and South Carolina and Georgia. And I have been impacted and have witnessed and experienced white supremacy and its manifestations in every single part of the country I have ever lived in and visited. And so, right, and so this is not unique at all to any particular geographic location in our country. And I think that's also important as well. And a lot of the research that I've done has illustrated that as well.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, DL. Craig, welcome back.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is California time morning as well. So my name is Craig, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm a radical father of two young white boys. And so there's a lot of that propels my work in studying and researching and confronting and eliminating white supremacy. Professionally, I serve at Samuel Merritt University as assistant professor and assistant vice president of enrollment and student services. And I think my short answer to why I said yes to scholarly work around white supremacy and eliminating white supremacy is it's a racial legacy offset for my family and my ancestors, and all the harm that they've perpetuated in the building of this country. And as a way to then begin to pay it forward so that my boys become different kinds of white people in the world, and wanting to inspire a different generation that is just.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you. Claire, can you begin by talking a little bit about the historical context in which the tragedy in Charlottesville unfolded? Obviously, none of the issues that are facing us in 2017 are new, but in my experience and in the conversations I'm having, there feels like a new sense of urgency. So if you could kind of situate for us and the viewers how this fits into a larger time frame and how history helps us understand our present reality.
Absolutely. So the tragedy in Charlottesville is certainly rooted in many historical realities, like you said, and I'd like to share just 3 of those. The first is that some of the most venerable institutions of higher education in the US were quite literally built by enslaved African people. And they were built by enslaved African people following and concurrently with the genocidal removal of indigenous people. And while it's easy to point to institutions in the former Confederacy, institutions beyond the South are not exempt from direct ties to the work of enslaved people, the transatlantic slave trade, and the material benefits that accrued and still accrue to wealthy, mostly white people whose riches derive in whole or in part from the uncompensated labor of enslaved African Americans prior to emancipation and the continuing undercompensated labor of marginalized people, including but not limited to people of color. And while Confederate monuments are among the most egregious markers of American higher education's relationship with slavery, the roots of white supremacy go much deeper than statues of Confederate soldiers. And that was just the first reality. So the second one is that history tells us that when socially conservative political leaders are in positions of power, they and their networks embolden white nationalists. But let's be very clear, they've been present all along. My mom would send me Southern Poverty Law Center newsletters and highlight where the hate groups were active near where I lived in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland for the first 10 years of my adulthood. And that's recent. So they've been present all along. And when these conservative leaders are empowered, white nationalists seek out larger platforms for mobilizing their efforts, gaining money, gaining power, and gaining media attention. And the last reality has to do with what critical race theorists call interest convergence. And that refers to Derek Bell's thesis that the majority group tolerates advances for racial justice only when it suits its interests to do so. So of course, we're talking about white people's interests. And so time and time again, racial justice movements in the US gain ground after a catalyzing event in which racism hurts a white person or white people. And the history of the United States, including the history of higher ed in the United States, tell us it almost always takes a challenge to the safety, the security, or the well-being of white people for the arc of history bend towards racial justice.
So is that last point partially why you feel like it took centering whiteness to talk about white supremacy?
I do feel that way. I'm curious what others think as well. I do feel like it very often media attention seems to follow, and the outcry of everyday white people and the cascade of events that sets in motion does tend to follow the death or the another tragic injury to a white person or white people. People of color die every day because of white supremacy, and unfortunately there just has not been the same response.
Thanks, Claire. So DL, monuments is partially what this conversation begins with, or in some ways. And they are symbolic reminders of our nation's past. And they're also a part of a hidden curriculum or overt curriculum that we're teaching on our campuses about white supremacy. And they're prominent on many campuses, monuments to the Confederacy, monuments to other people who stole land from Native peoples. What should our institutions of higher education do to talk about the history of race on our campuses while also understanding the implications of both keeping monuments or taking them down?
Certainly. Well, I think I would begin responding to that question, Heather, by, I think, challenging the framing of monuments simply as symbolic reminders of our nation's past. Monuments are tools of veneration, right? They're the means by which we celebrate certain people, certain incidents, certain events in our past, the things we want to remember, the things that we name buildings for, that we build statues for. Those are the folks whose photographs and artwork we hang in our buildings and surround ourselves with, right? And so particularly in institutions of higher education, that's why they're part of the hidden curriculum, right? It's because they are serving that purpose of veneration and lifting up as role models, of examples, of et cetera. And so when we vision to first name a building, or then to continue to maintain the name of the building, a statue in a certain location, we also continue to highlight and celebrate of what that person did and stood for, right? And so I think going back to Claire's initial point, these monuments are there for specific purposes. And I think one of the things that has come out in writing by several people over the last several weeks, and actually since Bree Newsom took down the Confederate flag over the South Carolina State House, in these pieces that recognize that these images and these statues, these monuments, in large measure went up, particularly across the South, at a particular moment, right? They went up, think about the Confederacy, they went up at a particular moment in the Black struggle for freedom in the United States, right? Where there were protesting for the manifestation of the rights that we were supposedly had been granted, right, by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that were being, blocked and had been blocked for a century. That these monuments went up as a sign of rebellion against that liberation, as a sign of adherence to a time when there was particular in the enslavement and the ongoing enslavement and disenfranchisement, particularly of Black people in this country. Okay. And so when we maintain that we need to have the monuments in order to learn our history, there was a wonderfully sardonic, sarcastic Twitter thread a few weeks ago by a historian talking about the ridiculousness of centering monuments as a tool of learning history, right? We have monuments to people who did not, and characters who did not exist. And I think about the Rocky Monument in Philadelphia. That's not how we learn history, right? We learn history through other things. It's the need for these to be the center places, the focal points of our campuses, in order for us to recognize where we've been and how we got here. And those things need to be contextualized. So, one of the things you asked me about, what can institutions be doing? I think about the framework, the campus racial climate framework that Sylvia Hurtado and her colleagues published 20 years ago, literally now, it's been 1997, is when that article first came out. So thereafter, I think the next year in an Ash Eric monograph that talks about one of the points in that framework is institutions acknowledging their legacy of inclusion and exclusion, okay? And I think that has to go beyond simply, you know, lots of people have pointed to the work that Brown did and was one of the earliest institutions, Brown universities, trying to reckon with its own history and the reality that it exists literally because of profits from the slave trade. And also we cannot forget from the genocidal removal of indigenous people from these lands that made the building of these institutions even possible in the first place, as well as the enslaved labor that built them. But it has to go beyond producing a 100-page document, right? Other institutions have done the same. Harvard has started this work, Yale has done this work, many of the Ivies have done this work. And it can't just be the institutions that were founded during the settler colonial era of this nation. And all these institutions have a history, have a legacy in some way, shape, or form that needs to be talked about, and not just in a document that can be found online, maybe if you search hard enough and have the time to sit down and read it. But if we're, you know, move the monument, let's talk about Robert E. Lee and the role that he played and put that in a wing of a museum in which there is a broader discussion around what he did. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson as a whole person, and what does it mean that he not only enslaved but engaged in slave rape, okay? And also out of the other side of his mouth was talking about democracy and liberty. We need to have both of those conversations and recognize, well, what does it mean then? What do we do with this? What does this mean for us as an institution? But I think particularly in the context of UVA, an institution that was founded literally as this man's dream, right? How do we reckon that? And I think doing that can lead to us also as individuals reckoning with the inconsistencies that we all bear. And what do we do with that, and how do we dare to try to make positive impacts when at the same time each and every single one of us is also invested and benefiting from, right, oppression of certain other people, as well as perhaps even actively engaging in that oppression ourselves, right? And so it raises the bar, I think, for a different kind of conversation about what it means to be leaders, about what it means to be members of a society, period. Leadership, and definitely not simply talking about positional leadership, but what does it mean to be members of a society? What does it mean to be members of a community? What does it mean to talk about legacy, right? We must have a much more nuanced conversation that we can't have if we simply keep talking about, well, we need the monument in the center of the quad because the monument has always been in the center of the quad.
Yeah. I'm curious about the conversations that are happening or maybe not happening. Craig, to shift away from history for a moment to present day, on our campuses, some of us are getting geared up for the fall semester. Like, can you talk a little bit about the tone and tenor and how those in student affairs or how those in your circles are talking about or not white supremacy?
Right. Wow. So it's an interesting thing, and to come after what DL shared, this. In some ways, this is not new. In some ways, this is like, what? For people who haven't been paying attention. And I think it's for those of us that it surprises. It's a failure for us to reconcile with our own histories, and our histories as individuals, our histories as institutions, our histories of higher education in this country, a history of democracy and whiteness and maleness and patriarchy and classism so I think it's just there's lots of conversations and lots of struggles, and on top of this, we have DACA, and we've had 9 months of terror from our presidential, our government. And it's only new in the sense that we happen to have such a radical terrorist as the president. He's not the first white racist president that we've had, white male racist president that we have, but he has this furor about it, about how he's going after a whole lot of people. And so it's an interesting, lots of struggling. I think there's fear, there's a knowing, and I'm talking faculty and staff and students. And so it's on one hand, we're talking about our team here. How do we hold and care for when people are really truly fearful about their safety and their ability to stay and their ability to thrive on campus? And at the same point, how do we then begin to have those more nuanced conversations as an administration, so that oftentimes we jump to action. Oh, we got to do something. We got to pull down a statue. We got to do a program. We got to have a town hall. And how do we also, while we're caring for people, how are we slowing down to be able to make sure that we are doing our own work to begin to understand how we are deeply connected to, in this case, white supremacy, and what we want to do differently about it. And I also say, like, I'm not sure we fully know where our communities are, where our campus is. I will say I don't, we here at Samuel Merritt don't fully know where our community is and the work that we need to do to be able to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Alex, you have some thoughts on this related to your campus or the campus from which you just came?
Yeah, so I would say it's interesting being a graduate student outside of the Division of Student Affairs. I think I have even more empathy for faculty colleagues who are like, what's going on campus? I do want to make the point, though, that I think in talking about how we as professionals need to think about white supremacy, right, none of this is new, number one. Number two, I would say that we have so many current examples of how we can talk about this that if we just default to Charlottesville, we're going to be in trouble. So let's talk about Hurricane Harvey, right, and disaster relief, and who's going to be the focus of disaster relief as part of the white supremacy project, right? You have people who are undocumented who do not feel safe going to shelters in Houston at this moment, right, because of the white supremacy project, right? So it is important to say that we can pull so many examples together of what's happening right now to really talk about it. And if we want to talk about Charlottesville, let's talk about the point Claire talked in the beginning, right? It took a white woman's death to have this conversation. It didn't take Ferguson, it didn't take Mike Brown, it didn't take Trayvon, it didn't take any of these other folks, right? It didn't take trans women of color to have this conversation, right? And so that is really important to think about as we're thinking through, like, what is the tone and tenor? Because, you know, I will acknowledge, like, I'm from South Florida. My parents are in Fort Lauderdale this moment, right? And I'm thinking about Irma right now, and all of my family who are choosing to evacuate for one reason or another, or not, as the lived realities of how white supremacy works, even in these moments that we think are completely devoid of white supremacy. They are actually shaped by the white supremacy project. And if we don't start thinking about these things in this way, we are just going to be back here again. We're going to be back here again anyway, right? But let's be, again, like, in thinking through this deeper and further too.
Yeah. I thank you so much for that, Alex. And I want to acknowledge the great comments that we've been having from Twitter, which jump back to the previous question about monuments, because we have monuments in the form of football stadiums and libraries that also serve as hidden curricula of whiteness, as Moira Zois says. And then Allie mentions they're not always physical. Sometimes they're chairs named after folks, like at Harvard Law, the Royal Chair. It's funded by the slave economy. So Allie, Watson, Moira, thank you for your comments. And Alex, to jump back to you just for a second, because I think one of the other kind of parallel pieces, we're talking about monuments, we're also, I'm hearing a lot of conversation about free speech on college and university campuses. And I put that in quotes because I think that's the crux of the issue is, you know, what are the considerations for scholars and practitioners who are thinking through what free speech narratives mean, particularly related to outside speakers? And are there any connections that we can draw, like with our student affairs professional preparation and the work that we're doing in our scholarship as well?
Woof. Yeah. So, so first I want to say that free speech does not mean speech free of consequences, right? I think we use this as an amorphism all the time in higher education to sort of be like, oh, I don't want to have any meaningful reflection about what this means, but this is just a thing, right? It's like an axiom in research. We just don't question it or like think about it that often, right? And I want to use two particular examples to think through that we actually don't value free speech really that often. So one, and we're going to tweet out this resource, there's a great episode of the Hidden Brain podcast. It actually just came out just yesterday. So in addition to all this reading I'm doing, I'm now trying to fit in more podcasts as well. And the Hidden Brain episode talks about a researcher in Kansas who talks about the justifications people have for free speech. And he finds that folks who are trying to use free speech as a defense often have racial animus or high racial animus attitudes, right? And so they're using the defense of free speech to justify the content of speech, but not the speech itself, right? And so we have to start having this reflective conversation about what we mean in speech, because if we as higher ed professionals just say free speech is a thing, where is our role to help people reflect on these things, right? Where is our role in helping folks think through the morality and the ethics dimensions of free speech, right? I also want to talk, like, this is like the free speech absolutionism that we sort of see. We sort of just drop it, leave it alone, don't do anything about it. A few points to that. One, we all know that we are unequal before the law, right? So as if we think of protesters who are racially minoritized by their gender, right? We don't have access to free speech in the same way that people who are white and who are cis and who are men do, right? Our bodies are already suspect. And so there is just this point that gets lost, that really is just, I am really unmoved by when people are like, oh, well, we all have access to it. No, we don't. We all have access to it in very different ways, right? Two, I think this has such implications for moral development, right? I personally love moral development. I would think we need to talk about it in more complicated ways, though. So if we all sort of default, right, to this, like, whatever the law says is good, but for everything else we make meaning of, we're like, but the law seems to be in question, doesn't it, right? There is just sort of we're sort of using different moral development frameworks for ourselves, right? To justify our own actions. You know, the article out of Kansas, you know, talks about the main justification for people using a free speech argument was so that their speech that they wanted to do later could be protected. That's wild. That is wild, right? And people will counter back and say, well, there's a slippery slope between defending free speech, like what can we do? That makes us sound like we cannot do cognitively complex things. That is what our whole field talks about moving us to. And so for us to say, like, oh, we won't know how to differentiate speech like this, other countries have been doing it, y'all. There are other countries who have hate speech codes. It is the US exceptionalism that prevents us from looking at other people, how they're doing things and doing them well, right? This was the example about monuments in Germany. There are not monuments of Nazis in Germany, right? And so we can look to these international and global thinking, again, something we stress in the field, but yet somehow we don't like doing it ourselves, of thinking about how we think through these decisions. The last thing I'm going to make a point of, again, because there were folks, I'll use the example of Milo Yiannopoulos, who came to Michigan State, where I worked previously last year, and folks were defending Milo's speech to all get out until he made comments about statutory rape. And then his book deal got pushed, Breitbart even stopped publishing him, and no one outcried that his speech was being denied. Nobody. These same platforms were saying all of these other things about how his platform was being denied. But this thing, oh, we don't tolerate that speech. So no go, right? And we can make the argument that they're not state actors, all this stuff. I'm happy to have that conversation. But until we start helping students and ourselves reflect more about what we mean about free speech, we're just being hypocritical. And we're not having the morally relevant conversations that we say we want to have with students all the time.
Claire, you have a point you want to make about this?
Well, first of all, you know it's bad when Breitbart pulls you. You know it's bad. Second, I'm ready for Alex to come speak in my student development theory class about moral development. And third, as Alex was talking, I was thinking about how we act like a lawsuit is the worst thing that could happen on our campuses. You know what's a bad thing that can happen on our campuses? Our DACA students being told they have to leave. You know what's a really bad thing that can happen on our campuses? Students being killed off campus. You know what's a bad thing that can happen on our campuses? What's happening right now. Mm-hmm. So the thing about fear of a lawsuit is that's really about fear of getting caught having a morally complex conversation. And that is, in fact, the kind of behavior that is best described at the lowest levels of moral development in some of the earliest theories guiding our profession by Kohlberg and Rest. And we got to do better, and we can. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's it.
So, Claire, when you think about kind of some of the roots of this, and I think that there's a New York Times article that talks about this polarization versus focus on the common good. Can you talk a little bit about how protests, is this contributing to a feeling of polarization in society? How is polarization negative, positive? Talk with me a little bit about that.
Well, so you had raised this question a few days ago, Heather, and as some of us were talking about it, I was thinking there's something about this idea of polarization that always really bothers me. It feels very emblematic of and a contributor to preserving the status quo, because we don't the thing the thing that people will say on Facebook or other social media platforms will be, to everything's so polarized today, and you can almost hear the can't we just get back to the middle and uphold the status quo. And it took me a few days to land on it and remember that it's Tema Okun who would remind us that white supremacy culture thrives on polarization. So what this means is that, of course, student affairs educators have to create spaces where the myths of polarization can be challenged, that, there's sort of these equal perspectives as, the president so now infamously mentioned about multiple sides. So we have to do better. College students, most do have more common ground than white nationalists would want us to recognize. And white nationalists and others who intentionally and explicitly uphold the ideology of white supremacy, in addition to all the ways that it's more implicitly embedded in all of our systems, they know they lose their power when people with a diverse array of perspectives agree that white nationalism is bad. And the challenge is that doing this kind of work every day as a student affairs educator contributes to racial battle fatigue. And so when white people don't take up the work, we're condoning work environments that exploit the knowledge and skills of our colleagues of color. And at the same time, and I really am speaking to monoracial white individuals here, it's not appropriate for us to try to do this work alone without our multiracial and monoracial colleagues of color, because nothing about us without us, right? So we have to fight the myths about polarization and recognize that this idea of sort of two opposing sides is something that's what we need to challenge. What we need to challenge is a culture that asks us to look away when violence is happening and when we're condoning it.
Yeah, for sure. DL, talk with me a little bit about similarities, differences, how UVA is centered in this, how UVA is similar or different than any other campus in the United States, and Charlottesville in particular, like why they're.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to note that in many ways, the fact that this happened at UVA is a singular reality only because UVA happens to have a statue of Robert E. Lee in the center of campus. This could have been a flashpoint and something used at any campus across the country. That I really do not think that this could not have happened at X place. This could have happened anywhere. The reality is that things like this have already been happening at other places and just haven't gotten a national news attention. And so to point to what Alex said earlier, their point about the fact that it was the murder of a white woman who drew this into into the conversation. So this has happened and could happen anywhere across the country. And so in that way, UVA is much more similar than it is different to any other institution. The other thing, and I think we were going to tweet out the link to this New Yorker article or in the Atlantic, there's been these think pieces that have talked about, well, wait a minute, Charlottesville, the Atlantic talks about many university towns as a progressive enclave. A pushback on that comes from the New Yorker article is that what happened in Charlottesville is less, and I'm quoting from the article here, what happened in Charlottesville is less an aberrant travesty in a progressive enclave than it is a reminder of how much evil can be obscured by the appearance of good, which of course should remind us of Martin Luther King talking about the failure of white moderates, right? And his recognition that white moderates are really the main problem to barriers to actual experiencing liberation for multiple groups of people in this country. It's held up by white moderates, those so-called progressive enclaves, right? So progressivism also in this context does not mean anti-racist. It doesn't mean anti-white supremacist at all. And in many ways, in these very same progressive enclaves where other much more perhaps subtle instances and uses of white supremacy continue to flourish, okay, and are upheld, right? And so we have before us this week, just brought to us yesterday by the current administration, an example of that. I mean, the rescission of DACA is itself a white supremacist policy, right? The fact that it even had to be instituted is an example of white supremacy. The way this entire nation deals with immigration and citizenship and its own national borders and boundaries has been drenched, dipped in, soaked in white supremacy. So it's part of the fabric of how we do business, and being a progressive enclave doesn't have anything to do with that. It means that if anything, we're nice about it, right? Or this faux civility where, oh my gosh, I would never hold a tiki torch, but we do the things that enable white supremacy all the time. Daily lives, daily habits, right? The way that we structure wages, the way that capitalism is structured in this country, the fight that people have to fight for a living wage. Think about the fight for 15 going on across the country right now. I've already talked about immigration, talked about the removal of indigenous people from the right to control the land that they were on already. Colonialists came here. it's part of the fabric of how we do business. And so in that case, yeah, it's part of the fabric of how we do higher ed too. So as we think about Lori Patton Davis's article, 2016 Urban Education on Disrupting Post-Secondary Prose, right? So it was where she's talking about the realities of how white supremacy is baked into the structure of higher education, the curriculum of higher education, the practice and the policy of higher education, in such ways that people have been taught that these are privileges that they should expect to have the right to have. They see that being pulled away, the backlash could happen anywhere, right? And has been happening and will continue to happen anywhere.
So this kind of begs so what do we do about this within our spheres of influence, and certainly within our professional preparation programs, within our associations? Claire has a dissertation defense at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to direct to you, Claire, and then let you pop off because I know you need to be on time for that. That's an important piece. But Claire, do you want to talk a little bit about how we can challenge white supremacy within our student affairs prep programs and curriculum and literature, et cetera?
Absolutely. I think actually the conversation each of the conversations each of the sort of pieces of conversation that's been part of this larger conversation today is the kind of conversation we need to be having in our classrooms and outside our classrooms with students who are in our preparation programs. And often I find that faculty are the ones who need these conversations the most. And so that's a challenge to my faculty colleagues to center your own learning in the unlearning of white supremacy so that you can be prepared to work alongside students who are ready to dismantle the oppressive structures that guide our theory, that guide our research, and that guide our practice. And of course, many students are also not ready. And I think that there's got to be a lot deeper dive into being unapologetic about how it is that we structure our classrooms and whose interests are centered. So let's not organize our classrooms and our syllabi and our curricula around white fragility. Let's organize them around disrupting white supremacy. So there are lots of great resources about how to do that. And I think we need to create more as well.
One being authored by our missing panelist, Mapta Agapati's piece about When White Women Cry.
Absolutely.
Absolutely need to tweet that today because it's a fabulous point to make related to that. Thanks, Claire.
Absolutely. I wish you all well, and I'm going to go support the work of a wonderful doctoral student at Virginia Tech who is troubling student development theory with a gendered lens even as we speak. So take good care.
Thank you so much for your contributions, Claire. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Bye.
We're going to, as Claire pops off, continue the conversation because we've had several great comments from Twitter. We're still going to try to end relatively around 2 o'clock Eastern time. But I want to pick up on this kind of idea about our professional preparation, as well as, the skills and competencies and knowledge. Craig, can you talk a little bit about, from your vantage point as a student affairs educator, as an assistant professor, and as an administrator, what do we need to be doing to better prepare folks to meet these needs given our changing realities?
So I think everybody needs to go take a class with DL and Claire, or have their program taken care of that. Just that consciousness. I think that I look to the professional competencies, and I think they are solid. They are a really good step forward. And as we've been talking, they're also deeply rooted, deeply marinated in white supremacy. And I think at the very minimal part, it is, the language even on the social justice and inclusion part is, it's may, and other ones are more definitive. And so, I see that as our struggle to really name white supremacy in our profession, and really advance ideas of moving forward, what our values are. So soapbox off that side thing. What I long for, the people that I want to work with and work alongside, and are people that are prepared to do their self-work, and how we are all, in this case, deeply invested, as DL shared earlier, in white supremacy. Like, it is in us all, and our work, while we may be done more work around some areas, like, there's still elements that still flow within us. And I know that because I continue to trip up on how white supremacy shows up in going to the grocery store, in even being in my house. The fact that we even own property and that we have fences in this world on indigenous land is all about this white idea of what it means to be citizens in this country. But I think mostly what I need is professionals, young professionals coming in who recognize that two things. One, racism doesn't need racists to perpetuate itself, and that to build on this idea that you can't be neutral on a moving train. Like, white supremacy and racism in this country is going, and it is, if we do nothing, we're riding that train. And what I'm looking for, and the people that I want to work with, and the people that I want on this team here, are people who recognize that their purpose on this campus is to interrupt that train, that system, and make a difference in every aspect of their role.
Mm-hmm. So DL, you're the new tri-director of the program. My alma mater, right. Colorado State University's SAHI program. Talk to me about, as the leader of that program, what you hope to do, or with your two other directors, to disrupt that curriculum.
Well, and thank you. And yes, I do want to acknowledge that I'm part of a leadership triad, particularly, but the work that curriculum revision requires is broader. Here at CSU is broader than just the three of us. So I want to also acknowledge the wonderful leadership that is continuing to be given by Dr. Kathy Cisneros and Dr. Pamela Gralia, and that started this actually in the spring, thinking about how do we revise the curriculum here to be consistent with the values we say we espouse, right? And so there is, without going into too much detail at this time, because we don't have a whole lot of detail to give right now, it's about recentering the philosophy, philosophical foundations of the program, right? And really thinking about, well, what is it we want to do here? What are we about? And building a curriculum and a program that is centered on that. And doing that boldly and doing that consistently, that also means, and we've already been having these conversations about, what does that mean for how do we build a faculty development? So we get people up to the point where they are able and competent to show up in the ways they need to in the classroom, to be in alignment with the values that undergird the program, and that's supposed to be expressed with the curriculum. Because you can have a great curricular model and wonderful set of values and philosophical paradigm, but if it's not being executed in the classroom on a consistent basis by the faculty who are principally responsible for coordinating and facilitating that space, it's going to fall on its face. Okay, and so that's what it's about. It means having to have really intentional, hard conversations about that, and having faculty be willing to opt into that, right? And if it's about opting into those things, and if you're going to opt into doing that, opting into doing the self-work necessary to be competent. I'll leave it there as time is getting short.
Yeah. So Alex, before we go to final thoughts, I am curious about one of the kind of final questions that we have, which has to do with how, our academies didn't have very many anti-racist scholars who were interrogating white supremacy in years past, right? And so now there simply just wasn't the level of pushback based on those who were kind of challenging these notions. So talk a little bit about how these things are all interconnected. Attacks on scholarship, white supremacy's attitudes towards academia, and how, as leaders, projecting yourself into the future as the dean of a college, which I know you will be, how should we go about protecting our scholars who are doing work around white supremacy, especially pre-tenure folks?
Yeah, I don't find it surprising that there is a devaluation of intellectualism in this country right now, and the attacks on the academy, because the academy is trying, not the big A academy, the undercase A academy, I might say, is trying to interrogate and go after whiteness in ways that are really important. So we have organizations like Campus Reform who are writing articles about actually many of our scholars in the field doing critical research as about attacking white people, all of these things, right? And so there's just like, campuses are not prepared for faculty to be attacked by their research. I think our campuses are places where we think of accidental violence happening, but never purposeful violence. Often the narratives around sexual assault are about strangers in a bush coming out, right? They're not about actually that 90% are people that we know, right? And so it is unsurprising, still surprising to me that many of our campuses are not equipped with methods to support their faculty when their scholarship is coming under attack, right? I have recent examples of this, of colleagues and friends and mentors of mine, and they're going after pre-tenure folks so they can't get and speak out about it, right? They're not gonna go after the full folks because they know, for the most part, they're shielded, right? They're gonna go after the folks who are trying to do this before they get tenure, right? So it's actually very methodical and very purposeful. So yeah, I'll leave it there for right now.
Okay. We're bumping up against our time, so I want to invite each of you to give us a final thought on this topic for today, a takeaway you want people to leave thinking about perhaps, and then any resource that you would maybe point to as a place to continue this conversation, because obviously in 1 hour, we can't talk about everything we would like to talk about. So Craig, I'm going to start with you for final thoughts and resources. Okay.
Oh, you got me. I wasn't ready. So just a couple things. On the Twitter feeds, Sonny J. Jones made a great point just about how we need to attack the resistance to change idea. The system doesn't want to change, and so as we're talking about resistance, I think we get. It's important for us to be courageous, eminently courageous, to push through this resistance and keep us moving toward this more just place. We hide behind order, and I need us to stop hiding behind order. And that's a challenge for myself. About any time that I've been uncomfortable and I've just wanted to be quiet because to keep the status quo, that's a time where I'm not showing up and being courageous to myself. I think my one offering, I don't know if you can see this, Racecraft, it's backwards, A Soul of Inequity in American Life by Karen Fields and Barbara Fields is mind-blowing. It is a beautiful piece of work that talks about the magic trick of white supremacy that has been perpetuated us on the American people, and how that has continued to be baked into our systems. And so it is not summer anymore, but please, that is excellent summer reading for us.
Great. Thanks, Craig, for those. Alex.
Yeah, so in closing, I'll say one is I continue to be baffled by a rejection of the R word, but yet white people's obsession with the N word, and how people don't want to be called racist, or like we can have racism without racist when we're all actually implicitly racist because we've all been born into the logics of white supremacy, number one. Number two, CJ Venable made this point on Twitter, and I want to circle back to it, is that we have professional competencies that say a lot of these things already. And for a field that talks about theory often, we still, in our professional practice and even in our professional preparation, still want to be atheoretical and don't go with these frameworks. This is the reason why ACPA has a strategic imperative around racial justice and decolonization. And so when folks make the argument, as they have been, that this is distracting from our work. This is a side thing. We're not living up to our mission of student learning and development. Until we interrogate how student learning and development continues to be attacked and shaped by white supremacy, we're not actually doing our work. We're just reproducing white supremacy, right? So I want to make sure to acknowledge that point. Third, a resource. I also Carol Anderson's White Rage. The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. She really talks and nails, I think, and really goes after this theory that sort of makes it sound like these critical moments in history happened and racism disappeared. I will let folks know or remind folks, the Brown v. Board of Education decision had to be issued 3 times by the US Supreme Court because people weren't listening to those directives, right? Everyone thinks Brown just happened and school desegregation was a thing like that. No, right? That's us being ahistorical. And so we need to reinvest in history to inform our current moment.
Great, thank you. DL, final word.
No. I was already unmuted, okay. I think that for me, I'll say a couple things real quick. One is that there is this conversation around value-free inclusion and having everybody at the table, which, okay, I'm going to keep it professional. In a higher education context, right, is, maybe I can't keep it professional, it's nonsense. It's not effective. It's not what we are supposedly about. You know, so if we're supposed to be trying to build critical competencies, critical thinking competency, and equip people for tools to participate in democracy. And I'm thinking about all these things that AAC and you know, the essential learning outcomes, right? And all of these things. Those are values implicit in that. We need a value-centered ethic, right? That clearly says, these are the things that we embrace, that we espouse, and that we can have reasonable discussion and debate about perhaps process and method, but we're not going to debate people and people's humanity, that we can have debate about how we get to an endpoint, but if that how includes that is based on the dehumanization of people, we are not going there. That's not a valid method. We need to have value-centered conversations. I mean, this is a point that I'm making in an article that there's an issue, special issue of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies and Education that hopefully the publisher will allow to come out and get over itself and allow to come out at some point. But it's an issue full of that Jim Shurik has curated, full of scholars speaking about the current moment and what it calls on higher education to do. And my particular piece in there talks about the need for us to talk about and be value-centered and be very clear about that and unapologetic for it. I definitely want to make that point. I think the other thing that I want to raise is, I know there was a comment that came up earlier in the conversation about, about free speech. And I think it's important to note that the Constitution is a document meant to regulate the interactions of not just a people with its government, and actually specifically about a people with its government, and perhaps also about how people engage with each other. But people have to be seen as human in order for those rights and abilities to be extended to them. And the reality is that in this nation, there has always been groups of people who have not been afforded the privilege of being human and being regarded as human. And that is why it's the murder of Heather Heyer, for instance, to have this conversation. That is why it took the white nurse in that hospital who was unjustly arrested to have a conversation about police brutality. That is why it took the woman in Minneapolis to have the conversation about police extrajudicial murder. That is why the people who have been afforded humanity, Indigenous people, racially marginalized people of color, undocumented immigrants who, particularly when they are from Black and brown spaces and have Black and brown bodies, that these are the folks who are not considered human in our nation. And until we reconcile with that, we will never actually dismantle the white supremacy project that Alex named earlier in this conversation. In terms of resources, all my books are still in boxes, so I can't show you things physically, but I will recommend, Claire talked about that history of higher education being built on the backs of enslaved labor and on the land of Indigenous people. Craig Stephen Wilder's book, Ebony and Ivy, is an excellent text. Thank you, Craig. That documents that history, a portion of that history, particularly through the early 19th century. I would also recommend Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, and Glenn Sean Colthart, I believe, is the author's name. Redskin White Masks is the title of that text. The subtitle I have somewhere in this document, but I can't find it. But that's Redskin White Mask Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, I think, is that full title. I think any of that, and just, basically resources. There is so much already out there written by Indigenous and racially marginalized people. Listen, dang it, just listen, read, do the work. It's there. Use your Googles. The work is there. That's all I got.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. My alma mater is in good hands, DL. Thank you to the three of you, and to Claire and to Mapta. I hope everything is okay on your campus. We will be thinking about you. To the three of you and Claire, just absolutely grateful for the time that you spent today and the good work that you all continue to do. And I know this episode will be one that I go back and watch in entirety so I can soak up all those things that you all said. Thanks again also to our program sponsors, ACPA and Eb Stoner. Coming up very soon on Student Affairs Live, Tony Duty, in fact, next week on Student Affairs Live, Tony Duty will be back here talking about implicit bias, so related topic. And please stay tuned to our hashtag for more information about this and upcoming episodes. You can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to our newsletter. You can browse our archives at higherlive.com or subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks again to the fabulous panelists today. Make it a great week, everyone. And thanks for everyone who's watching. Bye-bye.